The envelope landed on the kitchen table with a sound I'll never forget. Not loud, just final. Like a door closing on 40 years of my life. My daughter-in-law didn't even look up from her phone. "Sign it," she said, "or I take Eli, and you never see him again." I stood there, in my own kitchen. The kitchen where I'd made pancakes every Saturday morning since my son was 7 years old. And I looked at her across the table, and I thought, this is how it ends. Not with a fight. Not with lawyers. Just a woman in expensive yoga pants telling a 63-year-old man to hand over everything he built. I didn't sign. Not that morning. But I want to tell you what happened after that. Because what happened after that is the reason I'm still standing. My name is Walter. No, wait, let me start over. Not with my name. With my hands. I have carpenter's hands. Broad across the knuckles, scarred in 3 places, a permanent callus on my right index finger from 40 years of holding a pencil over blueprints. I built my first house at 22, a small colonial in eastern Pennsylvania. Nothing fancy, but I framed every wall myself, and I remember the feeling when the roof went on, like I'd done something permanent, something that would outlast me. I built 11 more houses after that. Started a small construction firm, just me and 2 guys I trusted, then 5, then 14 at our peak. We weren't a big company. We never tried to be. But we were solid. We finished what we started. We showed up on time. In this business, that's everything. My wife, Carolyn, ran the office. She was better with numbers than I ever was, and she had a memory for names that made clients feel like family from the first phone call. We were partners in the real sense. She kept the lights on while I kept the walls straight. She died 6 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 8 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I won't talk about that. Some things don't need to be explained to be understood. What I will tell you is that after she was gone, my son, he's 34, been married 4 years, started coming around more. Him and his wife. They'd have dinner with me on Sundays, help with yard work, talk about Eli, who was 3 years old and just starting to string words together into something that almost made sense. I thought that was grief bringing us closer. I thought we were becoming a real family again. The 3 of us, 4 counting Eli. I was wrong about what was bringing us closer. But I wasn't wrong about Eli. That little boy, from the time he could walk, he'd come find me in the garage where I kept my old tools, and he'd pull himself up on the stool next to the workbench and watch me with those serious eyes. Completely still. The way kids are when they're actually paying attention instead of just looking. By the time he was 3, he knew the names of every hand tool in that garage. Not because I drilled it into him. Because he asked. He'd say, "Pop, what's that one?" And I'd tell him, and he'd nod, and file it away somewhere, and 2 weeks later he'd use the word correctly in a sentence that would stop me cold. That boy was mine in some way I couldn't name. I knew it, and he knew it, even if he didn't have words for knowing. My daughter-in-law. I'll be honest with you, I tried to love her. I did. When my son first brought her home, I thought she was sharp, put together, the kind of woman who makes things happen. She worked in commercial real estate. She wore clothes that cost more than my first truck. She shook my hand with both of hers and looked me directly in the eye and said, "I've heard so much about you. I can see why he thinks so highly of you." I remember thinking, this woman knows how to talk to people. That's a skill. What I didn't understand yet was that it was only a skill, that behind it there was no warmth. Just strategy. The first sign was small. About a year into the marriage, she started referring to my construction company as your dad's little business. Not to me. To my son. I heard it once when I came through the back door and they were in the kitchen and didn't know I was there. I told myself it was just her way of talking. Careless. Not cruel. The second sign was when she started coming to Sunday dinners with suggestions. The house needed updating. The bathrooms were outdated. You should really talk to someone about doing a renovation, Pop. She called me Pop. I noticed she only called me that when she was about to ask for something. The third sign was the money. She approached me about investing in a real estate development she was involved in. A commercial property in the Lehigh Valley. Mixed use, good location near the new transit corridor. She showed me projections. They looked reasonable. She showed me who else was involved. Also reasonable. I put in $120,000. Money I'd saved over 30 years of early mornings and late nights and Carolyn's careful accounting. 8 months later, the deal collapsed. It happens. I didn't blame her for that. I told myself I'd made a bad investment, took the loss, moved on. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't find out until much later, was that she had walked away from that deal with a consulting fee. Paid out before the collapse. While I lost my $120,000, she cleared $38,000. I didn't know that yet. At the time, I just wrote the check off and didn't mention it again because I could see it embarrassed my son and I didn't want him caught in the middle. But she noticed that I let it go. And I think that told her something about me that she filed away the same way Eli filed away tool names. The pressure started about 18 months before the morning with the envelope. It was never direct. It was more like weather, gradual, atmospheric, something you feel in your joints before you can name it. My son started working longer hours. He'd miss Sunday dinners, apologize by text, say he'd make it up. When he did come, he seemed distracted. He and I used to be able to talk for 2 hours about nothing at all. Construction, football, a book he'd read. Now he sat at my table and looked like a man waiting for permission to leave. She stopped pretending the renovation suggestions were friendly. She started making specific requests. The master bath needed updating. The kitchen was inefficient. For resale value, Pop. I told her I wasn't planning to sell. She said you never know. Then she started talking about the business. My company was smaller than it used to be. I'd wound things down after Carolyn died. Let some of the contracts go. Reduced the crew to 5, took on mostly renovation work and smaller builds. I didn't need the volume anymore. I had enough. The business was still profitable, just quiet. I liked it that way. She didn't like it that way. She started suggesting I take on a partner. Someone with capital and connections who could grow the firm. She had someone in mind, naturally. A colleague of hers. I met the man once over dinner at a restaurant she'd chosen, and I watched him spend 45 minutes talking about himself, and I thought, this man has never held a hammer in his life. He wanted the business as an asset, not as a thing that builds houses. I said I wasn't interested. She didn't say anything at the table. She rarely said anything directly. But that night, when I walked my son to his car, he grabbed my arm and said, quietly, looking at the pavement, "Dad, she really thinks this is a good idea. Can you just think about it?" I looked at my son, who had my mother's eyes and his grandfather's stubborn jaw and who had cried for 3 hours at Carolyn's funeral, and then walked over to me and said, "Tell me what you need." That son, standing in my driveway looking at his shoes. "I thought about it," I said. "No." He nodded, but he didn't look relieved. He looked afraid. The slap happened on a Wednesday evening. Eli was sick, nothing serious, a fever and a cough, and I had driven over to their house to drop off soup and some children's Tylenol because my son had texted saying they were out. I let myself in with the key they'd given me, which, in hindsight, I should have understood was already something she resented. She was in the kitchen. She didn't hear me come in. I could hear her on the phone. And I caught pieces of it, something about documents, something about before he can do anything about it. And then she turned and saw me standing in the hallway and her face went through something fast, like a channel changing. And then she was calm again. "Pop," she said. "I didn't hear you." "I knocked," I said. "Door was unlocked." She smiled. "Ellie's upstairs. He's sleeping." I set the bag on the counter. I asked if my son was home. "Working late." I nodded, started to leave. I don't know what I said. Something small, maybe about calling if they needed anything. And she said something back. Something about how I needed to understand that this was their house and their family, not mine. Her voice was the same voice she used for everything. Smooth and level. And then she said something about Carolyn. Something about how things were different now. And I needed to accept that. And I must have looked at her a certain way because she walked toward me and she slapped me across the face with her right hand. It wasn't hard enough to knock me back. It was hard enough to be unmistakable. We both stood very still. I looked at her. She looked at me. There was something in her eyes that wasn't quite panic, more like calculation. Like she was deciding what story to tell. I picked up my jacket from the counter. I walked out. I got in my truck and I drove 2 blocks, and I pulled over and I sat there with my hands on the steering wheel for a long time. I didn't call the police. I thought about it. But I needed to think first. I called the only person I trusted without hesitation. His name is Frank. He was my accountant for 22 years, and before that he was the best man at my wedding. And before that we grew up 2 streets apart in Allentown and got in enough trouble together that we understand each other at a level most people never get to with anyone. He's 70 now, mostly retired, plays golf badly and gardens well. I told him what had happened. There was a long pause on his end. Then he said, "Walter, what was she doing on that phone call?" I told him what I'd heard. The pieces I'd caught. Another pause. "You need to talk to Martin." Martin was a corporate attorney Frank had known for 30 years. Estate planning, business law, exactly the kind of work I'd never needed until now. What am I going to say to Martin? You're going to tell him exactly what you told me, and then you're going to stop being so damned trusting. I met with Martin 2 days later. I told him everything. The investment, the business partner she'd pushed, the phone call I'd overheard, the documents she'd mentioned. He listened without interrupting, which is a thing I've come to associate with people who are actually thinking. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Your business. Is the ownership documented properly? Articles of incorporation, operating agreement, all current?" It was. I'd always been meticulous about paperwork, even when I wasn't meticulous about much else. And your house, sole ownership since your wife passed? Yes. Any joint accounts with your son? No. Carolyn and I had always maintained clear financial boundaries, not out of distrust, but out of tidiness. She called it keeping the books clean. Martin nodded slowly. "I think you need to do a few things," he said. Quietly, carefully, and before anyone realizes you're doing them. I asked him what he meant. He told me. Over the next 6 weeks, I did 3 things. First, I updated my will and trust documents, clearly specifying that the business and the house would pass to a trust administered by Frank for Eli's benefit when he came of age. Not to my son, not to her, to Eli, through Frank, with Frank having full discretion over management until Eli turned 25. Martin drafted it. I signed it in his office on a Tuesday morning. Second, I had a quiet conversation with my crew, 5 men who'd worked with me for between 8 and 15 years, and I formalized arrangements that had always been informal. Profit-sharing agreements, documented roles, nothing that would alarm anyone who didn't know what they were looking at, but arrangements that would make any hostile takeover of the business significantly more complicated. Third, I bought a small security camera, the kind that looks like a smoke detector. I installed it in the kitchen the next time I was at my son's house, when she was out and my son was watching the game in the living room. I told myself I wasn't doing anything wrong. I told myself I was just being careful. I was right on both counts. The envelope arrived 3 weeks after the camera. By then, I had footage of 2 phone calls. In the first, she talked to someone. I never identified who, about getting signatures before the quarterly filing. In the second, she talked about my business. She used a number. 400,000. that was somewhere close to what my firm's assets were worth. I hadn't shown anyone the footage yet. I was waiting. The morning she put the envelope on my kitchen table, she came alone without my son, which told me everything I needed to know about what my son knew. I sat down and I opened it. It was a proposed business sale agreement. My company to an LLC I didn't recognize, for $230,000, less than half what it was worth. Behind it was a second document, a quitclaim deed for my house. She sat across from me with her hands flat on the table, and she said, "Your son and I have discussed this. We need the capital. You're slowing down anyway. It makes sense." I looked at her. "I know what you did with that investment," I said. "The consulting fee." Something moved across her face. "I know what the business is worth," I said, "and I know what you were doing on that phone call in your kitchen 6 weeks ago." "You need to sign," she said. Her voice hadn't changed. "Or I take Eli and I make sure you never have a relationship with him again. I can do that. You know I can do that." I did know she could try, but by then I had talked to Martin about grandparents' rights in Pennsylvania. I knew what the law said. I knew what I would need to demonstrate. "I'm going to make you dinner," I said. She blinked. "What?" "Saturday evening. I want you and my son to come for dinner. I'm going to make a proper meal." I paused. "Invite whoever you need to. The man you've been talking to about buying the business. Bring him. You should have people there you trust." She studied me for a long moment. "Why?" she said. "Because I have something I want to show everyone at the same time," I said. "And I'd rather do it once." I want to be honest about the days between that conversation and the dinner. I wasn't calm. I want you to know that. I'm not the kind of person who moves through something like this with serenity. I'm a man who works with his hands and raises his voice at football games and cried in a grocery store parking lot for 20 minutes 3 months after Carolyn died because I reached for her brand of coffee without thinking. I'm not made of stone. I called Frank every day that week. He talked me down from 3 separate impulses to go over to their house and say things that would have felt good for 10 seconds and cost me everything. I worried about Eli constantly. I thought about him in his room with his fever, with his serious eyes, asking questions about things he decided mattered. I thought about what it would mean if she followed through on her threat. I thought about whether I was doing the right thing, the right way, or whether I was making a mistake that I'd spend the rest of my life measuring. Frank kept saying, "You're not doing anything to them. You're not ambushing anyone. You're just letting the truth show up for dinner." That helped. Saturday evening, I cooked a standing rib roast. Carolyn's recipe, or rather, Carolyn's mother's recipe, the one that requires you to start it the night before and tend it twice. I made roasted root vegetables, a proper salad, fresh bread from the bakery 2 blocks over that's been there since 1987. I set the table with the good dishes, the ones we got as a wedding gift and only used for company. Illy came with his parents and ran to me at the door the way he always does, arms up, full commitment, no hesitation. I held him for a long moment with my face against the top of his head. He smelled like children's shampoo and something that was just him. "You okay, Pop?" he said, 4 years old and already monitoring the emotional temperature of rooms. "I'm real good," I told him. "Hungry?" He said he was always hungry. The other guests arrived shortly after. The man she'd been talking to about buying my business, heavy-set, 50s, wore a blazer that was too tight across the shoulders. He shook my hand with the confidence of someone who had already decided how the evening would go. He'd brought his own attorney, which told me he'd been briefed on what was supposed to happen. What he hadn't been briefed on was who else I'd invited. Martin was there. Frank was there. And there was a third man, retired, gentle-looking, the kind of man you'd pass on the street without looking twice, who had spent 22 years as an investigative accountant for the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office and who had spent the past 3 weeks, at my request and Martin's direction, going through the paperwork trail of that real estate investment from 4 years ago. My daughter-in-law saw them when she walked into the dining room. She stopped in the doorway. I was in the kitchen. I couldn't see her face, but I heard the silence, which told me everything. We ate first. I'd thought about that. I'd thought about whether to go straight to business, get it over with, clear the air. But I decided no. Let it be a meal first. Let there be bread passed and food eaten, and Eli asking the man across the table whether his blazer was itchy. Let everyone be human for 45 minutes before the hard part. My son sat next to me. He was quiet through the meal, which was how he'd been for months. He ate carefully like a man aware of being watched. At one point, I put my hand briefly on his shoulder, and I felt him go very still, and then slowly, almost imperceptibly, lean into it. That's my son. That's still my son. After I'd cleared the plates and Eli had been settled in the living room with his tablet and a blanket, the 8 of us sat back down. Martin spoke first. He explained who he was and who he represented. He explained the nature of the trust documents and what they meant for the business and the house. He was precise and unemotional in the way that good attorneys are when they want the information to land cleanly. The man in the tight blazer started to say something about the purchase agreement. That's when the retired accountant, his name is Roy, and he has the particular stillness of a man who has sat across from liars for 2 decades and is not impressed by any of them. That's when Roy opened his folder. He walked through the consulting fee, the timeline, the emails he'd obtained through channels I didn't fully understand and didn't ask about. The way the deal had been structured to ensure she walked away clean while the investors absorbed the loss. He laid it out the way I imagine he'd laid out 1,000 things before, quietly, completely, without drama. The room was very quiet. My daughter-in-law said this is not what it looks like. Roy said, I've been doing this for 30 years. It's exactly what it looks like. My son was staring at the table. He hadn't moved since Roy started talking. I want to tell you what happened next, but I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. I didn't feel triumph. I've heard people describe moments like this as sweet, as satisfying in the way that justice is supposed to feel. Maybe that comes later. What I felt right then was a kind of sadness so heavy it was almost physical. Because the man staring at the table was my son. My son who had my mother's eyes. My son who had stood in a hospital hallway and held Carolyn's hand and told her he loved her more times in that last week than in all the years before it. Because that's what grief does. It makes us say the things we should have said all along. That man sitting across from me had let this happen, had been part of it, at minimum through his silence. And I had to live with that truth now, next to the other truths in the room. She left with the man in the blazer. There were words, from her, not from me. But I don't need to repeat them here. Words said under those conditions don't mean anything except that the person saying them is scared. When everyone else had gone, my son and I sat at the table. Eli was asleep on the couch in the living room. I could see him from where I sat, one arm thrown out, mouth open, completely at peace the way only children sleep. My son put his face in his hands. I let him sit there. Eventually he looked up. I didn't know about the investment, he said. I want you to know that. I believe you. I knew she was. I knew things weren't right. I just... He stopped. I know, I said. How do you know? Because you're my son. And because you're not a bad man. You're a scared one. Those aren't the same thing. He was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, What happens now? I looked at Eli sleeping on the couch. Now, I said, I think you have some decisions to make about what kind of man you want to be, and I think you already know what I hope you choose. He nodded slowly. I'll be here, I said. Whatever you decide. But I need you to know that I will always be here for that boy. That doesn't change. Nothing she threatened and nothing that happened tonight changes that. He looked at his son. Something moved across his face that I recognized from when he was 7 years old and had done something wrong and was trying to figure out if he could still be forgiven. He could. He always could. That's not weakness. That's just what fathers know about their children. That was 11 months ago. The business is still mine. The house is still mine. Roy's findings were turned over to the Pennsylvania AG's office, and as of last month there's an active investigation. I'm not holding my breath for anything specific. I've lived long enough to know that the law moves slowly and never in perfectly straight lines. But the information is where it needs to be. My son and his wife separated in February. He's in a one-bedroom in Doylestown, 20 minutes from me. He's been in therapy since March, which I know because he told me. He comes for dinner on Sundays now, sometimes with Eli, sometimes without. When it's just the two of us, we're learning to talk again. Slowly. It's real, though. More real than the last few years were. Eli spent last Saturday in my garage. We built a birdhouse from a kit he picked out. Cardinals, he said, because cardinals are red, and red is his favorite. He measured and marked and hammered with genuine focus, stopping to ask questions, processing the answers, filing them away. At one point, he looked up at me and said, completely unprompted, "Pop, did you know cardinals stay in one place their whole lives? They don't migrate." I said I did know that. He nodded seriously, like we had confirmed something important between us. I thought about Carolyn, who would have found some way to take that fact and turn it into something larger. Something about loyalty and home and why certain things are worth staying for. She was better with words than I am. But I understood what Eli meant, even if he didn't know he'd meant it. I'm still here. This is still home. Some things you build to outlast you. Some things do. I keep thinking about that Saturday dinner. Not the confrontation part, the part before it, when Eli ran through my front door with his arms up and his whole body committed to the idea that I would catch him. No hesitation, no calculation, just complete trust that I would be there. That's what I was fighting for. Not the house, not the business, not even the principle of the thing. Though the principle mattered, I was fighting for the right to be the person that boy runs toward. I've thought a lot about what made the difference between losing everything and keeping what was real. It wasn't luck. It wasn't anger. Anger would have destroyed me the night I drove away from that house with my face still stinging. What saved me was something quieter. It was knowing what I stood for and refusing to let fear make me into someone smaller than that. When my daughter-in-law put those documents on my table, she was counting on something she'd observed in me for years. That I would absorb the hit and go quiet. She wasn't wrong that I'd done it before. What she miscalculated was why I'd done it. I'd stayed quiet in the past because I was choosing my moments, not because I was afraid. There's a difference between patience and weakness, and she never learned to tell them apart. The night Frank told me to stop being so damned trusting, I didn't take that as an insult. I took it as the most useful thing anyone said to me that year. Trusting people is not a character flaw. Trusting the wrong people without evidence is. I had confused generosity with discernment, and I'd paid for that confusion in a way I'll be settling for a long time. But here's what I also know. The decisions I made after that night, the trust documents, the accountant, the dinner, none of those came from bitterness. They came from clarity. I sat down with Martin and Roy and Frank because I finally understood the situation completely, and I acted on what I understood. That's the only kind of response that holds up. Rage burns out. Grief paralyzes. Clear-eyed understanding. That's the thing you can actually build with. My son is doing the work now, slowly. I see it in how he talks, how he listens, how he sits at my table on Sunday evenings and stops checking his phone. He made bad choices and he's living with the weight of them, which is exactly what should happen. But he's not letting that weight bury him. That matters to me. Eli asked me last week if cardinals ever get lonely, staying in one place while other birds fly south. I said I didn't think so. I said I thought they just understood something the other birds hadn't figured out yet. He thought about that for a while. Then he picked up his hammer and went back to work. Some things you build to last. Some people too. If you're willing to do the hard, slow, unglamorous work of becoming someone worth staying for. I'm 63 years old. I have carpenter's hands and a one-bedroom my son rents 20 minutes away and a 4-year-old who knows the name of every tool in my garage. I have enough.